yes, some LPs were burned and maybe won't come back and invest in venture again, but others will have learned and understood that it is something that requires patience and it is something that requires a longer term view and a longer term horizon. And I do think we'll continue to see funds pop up in the region.
Welcome to the VC Evolve podcast, conversations about the future of VC. Our guest today is Aboudi Al-Qattan, principal at Dash Ventures, one of the longest standing VC firms in MENA, with a 13-year track record of venture investing. Prior to Dash Ventures, Aboudi was the founder of At-Tariq, a social enterprise that empowered refugees across the Middle East by teaching entrepreneurship skills. And listen to this. He was a professional basketball player who won 5 straight local championships. He also co-hosts Beyond the Buzzer, a podcast that explores the interplay of adversity, success, and balance for high-performance athletes. Aboudi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Ahmad, in doing my diligence for this podcast, I realized you love a good introduction, so allow me to return the favor. It's such a pleasure to be here, and the work you're doing with VC Evolve and VC React is so important for our ecosystem. So thank you, honestly.
Thank you so much, man. Okay, let's dig right into this. Forget about VC, basketball. Most of us in the VC scene, we come from boring backgrounds. With you, it's much more fun. Basketball. Tell us a bit about that and a bit about the podcast.
It's interesting. So I played for most of my life growing up, and it was always one of those things where I think I love the idea of kind of having a chip on my shoulder. You know, I'm 5'8". And a lot of people told me that I would never play pro. And then when I actually went to college, I broke my ankle and I thought I was done. So when I moved to Amman and I started working for Dash in 2017, I met Sam Douglas, who's now my co-host of the podcast. And he took a look at me. He found out that I had a Kuwaiti passport and was like, listen, you should play pro. I kept being like, man, like, of course not. You know, I'm happy in venture. I'm comfortable in Amman. Anyway, long story short, he took a video of me playing, sent it to the GM of my team in Kuwait, Nadi Al-Kuwait, and the guy called me on the spot and offered me a contract. And I was so lucky that my employers at Dash, my parents found out about this and all encouraged me to go do that and to pursue what had always been a childhood dream for me. So I went and I did it for 2 seasons. But as soon as I remembered that, you know, I'm 5'8" and my ceiling on the court is hopefully a lot lower than my ceiling off of it, I decided to come back into the venture world.
Wow, what a great story. Let's move to Dash Ventures now. On the website for Dash Ventures, I found this sentence. It says, investing across eras from seed to scale in markets that matter. You also focus on startups with global potential. And recently you've invested in a Pakistani company. Can you tell us about Dash Ventures investment thesis?
Definitely. So it's interesting. Khalid Talhouni said something very accurate on his episode with you, which is we speak so much about innovation in startups that we sometimes forget that innovation in venture is also equally as important. And the reason I say that is because the structure at Dash is very unique when you compare it to other VCs or typical VCs. Now, obviously, there are a lot of benefits of the typical VC model when you go off and you raise from a bunch of LPs. Those LPs can unlock follow-on funding for your startups. They can help you with BD, with due diligence, and create a proper ecosystem around a fund. But the way we operate with an evergreen structure is essentially that we are inherently patient, right? We don't externally fundraise. We're fully capitalized by our founding partners. And the idea was our founding partners were very instrumental in taking Hikma Pharmaceuticals public and in making Hikma Pharmaceuticals a company from the region that acquired companies internationally. It was not a company built to be acquired. So when they set up Dash in 2011, formally institutionalized in 2012, the idea was the same. Find platform businesses that will transcend generations and that aren't necessarily built to be acquired, but are built to acquire and to go and scale across multiple markets. Now, obviously, if you look at our portfolio, there are companies that maybe are only operational in a couple of markets, and that's to provide a certain level of liquidity for us. But typically, when we invest in a business, we do hope that it is a business that will scale across markets, across geographies, across continents. And the idea of building generational companies is because our founders understood that to build businesses, especially in emerging markets, you need to be inherently patient. And in doing so, understanding that a typical 5 to 7 year venture horizon doesn't really exist in emerging markets, especially because of the lack of liquidity in our market. And so when Dash was founded, the idea was let's build businesses that we really believe will be around for generations. And that's kind of the impetus of how we invest now. So when you mentioned, Postex, the Pakistani company we recently invested in, obviously when we invested, we were, incredibly impressed by the founder, Omar, by his team, by the product, by the technology. But what stood out for us was that this guy will not stop at building a business that's only operational in the region, right? He has his sights set on the world. And I think venture is inherently risky. So if you know that you're going to sign up for it, you may as well be backing people that are ambitious. He's not arrogant, but he's confident. And I think when you look at a lot of our founders, you find very, very similar traits. A lot of these guys and these women really are setting out to build companies that they think can impact people across the world. And that's what I think that sentence that you read off our website means.
Yeah, amazing. And I just have to ask this. So you mentioned the founders of Dash Ventures are the LPs in the fund, and you don't raise external funding. Those LPs came from pharmaceutical background. Why not focus on pharmaceuticals?
It's a good question. So I would say that, our founders were instrumental in helping Hikma IPO, right? Saeed Daruza, Ali Husseini, Amar Sati. But that's not their only scope of experience, right? The founders were also a big part of Capital Bank's founding in the region, which is now operational in Jordan and Iraq. Amar Sati himself had experience in investment banking and in venture as well. So I think two things to answer your question on why not to be healthcare focused. First and foremost, we do love digital health, right? One of our legacy investments is Al-Tibbi. One of our most recent investments is WellX. Both of those companies are operating in the region and focusing on digital health solutions. That said, we are in an emerging market, right? And having, at least in my personal opinion, having industry-specific funds limits you. We're agnostic, and I would say 90% of the funds in our region are agnostic. And for now, I think that's beneficial. Now, obviously, when you come from a certain industry like the founders of Dash and you possess a certain level of industry expertise, you do want to focus on adding value, where you can and where. But at the end of the day, Ammar, Ali, and Saeed, they're operators, right? So their experience comes in building businesses. Maybe Hikma is in pharmaceutical, but that doesn't change the fact that they know how to get a business off the ground and how to scale it internationally. So there are a lot of reasons why we don't just focus on digital health, but the main one is MENA is still a blue ocean. It's still an extremely exciting market with so many opportunities. So I think limiting ourselves to one industry would have been counterintuitive, honestly.
I was on a podcast with Hassan Haidar, and he said in Silicon Valley, you have to dig deeper to find the gold. But here, gold is laying around all over the place because it's a blue ocean. You can find really good companies trying to solve big problems easier.
It's starting to now. I would say it's interesting. So you and I spoke about this when we met. I think the quality of the deals that I've seen in the past 24 months versus when I started in 2017 has improved exponentially, right? So we are now finally at a time where I think the Middle East venture capital system, obviously there's still a lot of issues and there are things that might limit our potential, but we are at an inflection point right now where if things go our way, we'll have a really buzzing ecosystem. I really inherently believe that.
So over the past decade, you guys have deployed more than $80 million in startups as well as VC funds. Can you tell us about your investment thesis for funds?
That's a great question. So again, the evergreen structure and the focus on a long-term horizon allows us to experiment both in direct investments and in funds. Now, we're very intentional about the funds we invest in. So for example, in the past 2 years, we've made 3 investments in funds. One of them because they focus on emerging markets where we do not have a presence, but we understand there are still enormous opportunities. Don't forget, the team at Dash is quite small, right? On a day-to-day basis. It's the 3 co-founders I mentioned and myself. So as much as we try and do alone, we understand that we need partners in markets where we don't operate. So one of the funds was purely to have access to emerging markets where we don't have a foot on the ground, right? So that's places in Southeast Asia and stuff like that, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, another one of our funds is an AI fund focused in Silicon Valley. And the impetus there was, one, we met the founding partners a couple of times in person and started to really understand how much they deeply understand the space. But 2, because as much as people thought that Silicon Valley was going to be the home for Web3 and those sorts of things, it turns out that actually the UAE is a good breeding ground for Web3 amongst other locations. And what Silicon Valley is really excelling at is AI right now. So when we had an opportunity to invest in fund managers that have been established before and in a space that we don't fully understand quite yet, it made sense. There always has to be some reason or some way that we can learn as Dash when we invest in a fund. We're not financial investors at the end of the day. Like I said, our partners have always said, we'd rather build businesses that are going to be around for generations. We've got companies, by the way, Ahmed, that we invested in 2011 that are still active right now in our portfolio, right? So I think to answer your question about funds, it's if we can learn and if we can then take those learnings and apply them to some of our direct investments, then we'll always consider making an investment. Or if it's in a region that we don't typically invest in, that's also a good enough reason for us.
But if it's in a region that you don't focus on, do you ask for co-investment rights? Do you
It's funny. So we
study
haven't
funds?
yet done a co-investment in terms of the emerging markets, but that was absolutely the reason why we wanted to do, or one of the reasons why we wanted to do that emerging market fund. We do typically, when we make investments in funds, we are looking for quote unquote perks. Obviously, different funds offer different perks for ticket sizes and whatnot, but we try and be strategic in terms of our ability to help funds with their operational mandate or whatever it may be. But in return, we do always ask that we can see some of the deals they're doing, because the goal is, again, to essentially have direct access through those funds. So yes, we do try and co-invest. We have not yet, but that is the goal.
Yeah, and I think you're flexible with fund investments because your partners are the LPs. So you can invest directly in companies or invest in funds. Usually, VC funds are money managers. They take the money from their LPs to invest them directly in companies, unless it's a fund of fund. So in their mandate, I think they cannot invest in funds. But in your case, it's a totally different story.
Yeah, this is what goes back to why I feel very privileged to work in a place like Dash, is that opportunities come in different shapes and sizes. And one of the downfalls of traditional VC is that when you do go off and you raise from LPs, and there are all the benefits that I mentioned, but sometimes when you raise from LPs, there's also a lot of limitations as to how you can invest. You have very quick investment periods. You're not able to be, let's say, again, inherently patient. So that's what the flexibility is one of the things I really love about Dash. But if I can just give you one example I love to use to articulate what's unique about our structure, is that in 2020, after the first 2 months, when everyone thought that venture was going to plummet, and then all these deals and investors came out of nowhere, and companies were being overvalued, and startups were coming off every day. It's funny, I was like 24, 25, and I was pinging my colleagues every day saying, yo, we're missing out. Look at this company raising at this valuation, blah, blah, blah. And they were all just telling me, be patient, just wait and see. And we ended up not making an investment in a new company up until, I believe, the end of 2021. But in that period from 2020 to 2021, we actually reinvested in our portfolio 7 or 8 times. And what's so unique about that is that I think when you have a typical fund, your LPs may not allow you to have a certain amount of exposure to companies, or they might require you to have a certain number of portfolio companies in order to diversify risk. But our partners were like, listen, we have a legacy portfolio. Who knows what's going to happen with COVID? It's our obligation to continue to support those companies. So we did that for 7 months, and then things calmed down for a little bit. And then in the past, let's say 2 years, we've made 5 or 6 new investments, not including the funds that I mentioned. So I think, again, that ability to be flexible and agile, but also patient is what's very unique about our structure.
Okay, Aboudi, you mentioned the Evergreen model twice. Can you tell us more about that model? How does it really work? And if there is another VC firm out there and they want to adopt the Evergreen model, how do they structure that model?
Yes, I think one of the main things that I haven't really mentioned about how the Evergreen works is that the goal is to recycle the funds that we get. So we have had one substantial exit that repaid the entire fund, including all of our active investments right now. But after repaying the partners, we've actually used those funds to recycle into new investments. And that's what I think is quite unique about the Evergreen structure. Is the goal is, again, sustainability in a long-term perspective, and to use funds from exits and from liquidity events to continue investing in startups. And that's where I think that's where I know the sort of the difference from a traditional VC model is.
Okay, so here's my main question in this podcast that I ask every guest. What do you think of the current VC model? Any thoughts at all? Is it efficient? Is it broken? Any room for improvement? Give me your thoughts.
I think there's a lot of room for improvement in the traditional VC model. I think given that managers are incentivized to raise larger funds because that unlocks more of a management fee, sometimes it can create misaligned incentives, right? At the end of the day, the only way you can go raise fund 2 and 3 is if you're showing markups on fund 1. Essentially, as an LP, you're betting on investment managers being transparent about companies that are performing well and companies that aren't. So in that sense, you might have VCs that are encouraging startups to mark up valuations, even if they haven't done follow-on funding, just so that those VC investment managers can go off and raise based on those markups. So in that sense, I think, quote unquote, you could use the word it's broken. That said, I also think that because we're in an emerging market, the only way you can currently really evaluate companies when you're in a traditional VC model and you do have a lot of LPs is by marking up and going and trying to raise follow-on funds so that you can continue to support your companies going forward. One thing I'll say is that what I don't like about some of the venture models I've seen in our region is that I have a couple of investors in mind where they'll raise one fund, they'll invest in a startup, they'll raise a follow-on fund, but they'll say they can't invest in a startup in fund one with fund two. I find that counterintuitive. At the end of the day, venture is a game of backing your winners and supporting your founders. And the goal should always be to support the portfolio, at least in my opinion. So I think in that sense, there can be improvements. I also think there's a bit of education that needs to happen on the LP side, right? Don't forget that a bunch of LPs came into the venture world in 2020 thinking that it was going to be quick money and easy returns. So as much as I like to say that investors can do better, I also think LPs can do better, and understanding that this is a long-term game, that you should not be pressuring people to give you returns in 4 to 5 years. If that's what you want, go put your money somewhere else. But ultimately, if you're here for the venture game and you're here to help the ecosystem build, then you have to be patient.
Yeah, it's a cycle. When we first had Oasis 500 in Jordan, we had a bunch of angel investors who invested in companies thinking that those companies, all of them, will become the next Facebook and the next Google. But 3, 4 years down the road, most of these companies failed, which is expected. I mean, the success rate in startups is really low. But those investors,
Yeah,
they
but
stopped investing in companies as angel investors. And the same thing I think is happening with LPs.
yeah, I would agree. But when I said, a couple of minutes ago that the reason that in the past couple of years I've seen the quality of startups dramatically improve in our region, it's because people have gone off and failed and learned and come back and built and are now
Yeah.
building businesses with more of a sustainability aspect in mind and a profitability aspect in mind. You need failure for people to learn lessons, whether it's venture, basketball, podcasting, anything. And I think, yes, some LPs were burned and maybe won't come back and invest in venture again, but others will have learned and understood that it is something that requires patience and it is something that requires a longer term view and a longer term horizon. And I do think we'll continue to see funds pop up in the region. At the end of the day, we've had some really exciting funding rounds announced recently between Zena, Flapcap, et cetera, Postex, obviously. So for me, the more companies perform, the more we'll do better. And again, the one thing I told you, what I think is really relevant, is that even though venture is inherently a bit of a dog eat dog world, and I actually do agree with that, you should be fighting for the best deals for your firm. Right now in our emerging market in MENA, we don't have the luxury of having this mentality. We need to all collaborate. We all need companies to do well. We need to prove to the international markets and to the public markets in Saudi and the UAE that there is demand for venture assets, that there is liquidity. And only when we have consistent exits or consistent liquidity events by virtue of acquisition, by virtue of secondary sales, by virtue of companies going public, then we can actually have a buzzing ecosystem. So it makes no sense to put forward this dog eat dog mentality when we all need the wins to happen in order for us each to win. Honestly, that's what I
I
believe.
love that. I love that. Yeah, we should all collaborate to build the ecosystem and continue building the ecosystem until it gets to an international level and attracts more capital from other VCs. So,
But I don't necessarily think it needs to be international. Sorry to interrupt. I don't think it needs to.
mm,
The goal needs to be to attract international VCs. I think one of the things that will determine the future success of our ecosystem is how many companies can go public in Saudi and the UAE, right? And how much liquidity is there
mm,
from an individual or a consumer basis. So for me, yes, I think it's a very valid strategy to build a business in MENA and hope that or plan for an exit to an international company. But I think equally as important, and if not probably more honestly, we need to have companies going public in our markets. That's what's really going to drive liquidity and drive change in our ecosystem.
makes sense. Makes sense. So, what innovations in the VC model, whether locally, regionally, or internationally, have attracted your attention? Like, I know you're a big fan of the subscription fund model on Angel List. Tell us more about that,
Yeah,
and what else? What else
that's
have you seen?
it's a good question. I think the subscription model on AngelList has been very interesting. It's one of the funds that we invested in adopts that model. Again, it goes back to what Khalid was saying on your previous episode. It's just innovation and venture. It's giving investors a different way to interact with the VC fund. Instead of committing large pools of capital up front, you're committing on a quarterly basis. You have different access to different kind of deals. You're doing it through a platform like AngelList instead of going directly to a fund. So I think anything that challenges the typical nature of investing is something that's good for the ecosystem. I would say I've also started reading a lot about continuation funds, where you end up setting up a fund specifically for, high performing assets, and you move those to a different fund, and then you unlock different kind of capital for those funds. So, I can sit here and talk about CVCs, continuation funds, secondary funds, roll-in funds. I encourage people to be innovative in different ways of investing, so long as the goal is always to support the founders. One thing I think is really important that I learned from my colleagues at Dash, which I think a lot of investors don't really realize, is that when you invest in a startup, like, you work for the founder, not the other way around. So it doesn't matter if it's a CVC or a secondary fund, as long as the investors are, or a traditional fund, as long as the investors are understanding that their job is to support the founders and it's not the other way around, doesn't matter the structure. I want this to continue.
Okay, let me push back a little bit. So do you work for the founder or for the LP?
Oof, that's a good question, and one that's different for me, obviously, with the structure at Dash. I always say you work for the founder. At the end of the day, yeah,
Okay.
the LP is the one technically paying your management fee if you work in a traditional fund, but ultimately, LPs are giving you money to invest in startups to then return money to the LPs. So your job is to ensure that those founders are getting everything they need from you, right? Are you adding value? Are you taking away value? Are you not supporting the founders in the way you should? So no, honestly, I stand firm with the fact that I believe you should be working for your
Okay.
founders.
I love that. This is the founder focus. It's like the customer-centric model for Amazon and other startups. You're a VC and you're saying, hey, my customer is the founder, and I'm there to support those founders and help them become big, because this is how I make money anyway.
Exactly.
What's your favorite VC firm in MENA or internationally, whether US, Europe, and why?
It's a good question. So there's a couple of people we've really enjoyed working with in the past couple of years. I love working with Ahmad from 500. I love working with Tamer Kadumi and Venture Souk. I think for me, the thing I look for is, first and foremost, especially in venture, especially in larger funds, you don't ever really want to focus on the fund itself. You want to focus on a partner that you develop a relationship with. So, for example, Fund A can have 15 different partners. 10 of them can be good, 5 of them can be bad. You're not going to generalize the entire fund based on the 5 of the 10. You're going to essentially establish a relationship with one of the partners you like, and you'll do co-investment with them. So I think that's also a very important clarification, is that partners are not always responsible for the actions of the fund, and vice versa. So in terms of people, before my time at Dash, we worked very closely with the guys at Silicon Badia. Obviously, we co-invested with Jabbar and with Wamda. But for me personally, and the deals that I've done, I've enjoyed working a lot with Tamer and Ahmad, like I said. At least as another good guy from Access Bridge. Also, he's a very sharp
Oh
guy.
yeah, of course. When you got into VC years ago, how did you learn? What resources did you use to learn more about venture capital? Where do you direct new people in the venture space to go and read or learn or watch something?
It's a good question. And again, it's going to sound like I'm just, talking off my colleagues at Dash. But the reason I learned is because I was pretty much given responsibility from day one and told, you will get out of this what you put in. And I think having employers that allowed me to have that kind of responsibility allowed me personally to learn. I also don't think there were a lot of resources when I started that there are now. Now, and I'm not done with it yet, but I would absolutely recommend your book. Honestly, I think it's an essential, good
Thank you for
little
the mention. That was not the goal for this question.
I know, but it's true. I think Ahmad, your book is a very important part of breaking into venture. I read a lot of TechCrunch, the information when it comes to VC specifically. This guy that you said is helping you co-host the VC React podcast, who started Forward Start. I think his stuff is great. Baraka do a great little newsletter. So yeah, Jamie. So for me, it's like, obviously there are other things I read, but when it comes to venture, you just have to read a lot. You just have to read and understand what's going on, because things change all the time. When I started, Kiss Notes and Safe Notes were like just becoming a thing. So the big thing with venture, and like it's very consistent with doing DD on startups, is that you always have to be learning. You always have to research what's going on, what new trends are out there. That's kind of where I find the similarities between basketball and venture, is that it's very much an accountability game and an ownership game. If you take ownership and accountability in your progression, then you will get better. But if you kind of sit idly, then you won't. 0 to 1 is another good book.
I
And
love
there was
zero
one
to
more I
one.
read. Yeah. And Venture Deals is a classic one, honestly.
Of course, yeah, that's a must. Yeah. Well, how do you see the future of VC both in MENA or globally in the next maybe 5 to 10 years? What do you think will happen?
I so resent trying to predict things 5 years in the advance because you just never know what's going to happen. But to go off what I was saying earlier, at the end of the day, I inherently believe, and obviously I have to believe, right? Because I'm working in the ecosystem, but I inherently believe we're at an inflection point. And I think if we begin to see the establishment of more growth funds, so that's what's really missing in
Mm,
our ecosystem
yeah,
is funds that are set up to help companies go from Series A to B, C, D before the private equity money comes in. Then I think we'll have a very exciting time for our region. The other thing I'll say is that perspective is everything. So people say that MENA lags behind the West, but the lag behind is actually a very good thing. We're able to see trends develop in real time in the West, and then come back and curate them for our region and learn from the mistakes of what's happening in the West. Because even in the most developed market in the US and in Europe, there are obviously startups that are going to fail. There are trends that aren't going to work out, and I think approaching venture in that way, where it's like let's use more developed markets to learn, is a way that we can ensure that our region has a sustainable venture capital ecosystem. So for me, to like summarize, if we're able to have the establishment of growth funds and LPs commit to growth funds, and we help companies go from Series A to Series B to Series C, then we'll start to see more companies going public. Then we'll start to see more liquidity. Then we'll see international interest in our region, and we'll have this ecosystem that we all thought we were going to have a couple of years ago. It's obviously been delayed, but I don't think that means it's not there. I think the talent is exceptional in our region. Even small markets like Jordan, where maybe the building a startup or building $1 billion startup isn't exactly realistic, you have very technically capable founders. So people we have, opportunity obviously we have. Question is, are we able to learn from our peers and then build businesses that are better curated for our region here?
I love that. I love the optimism in this. And I agree with you. I think it's happening. It got delayed, but it's still happening. And is there anything else you want to mention that I didn't ask you about?
Honestly, no, you do a great job of asking the tougher questions, and that's why you're doing what you do. So again, all I can say is genuinely thank you for allowing me to be a part of it, but more importantly, thank you for everything you're doing for our ecosystem, because just as important as growth funds being set up is content and interest in our region, and both your podcasts are definitely doing that.
Well, thank you so much, Aboudi, for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation and you gave a different perspective to the VC evolve process, the evolution of the VC and the future of the VC. Thank you so much.